Hello friends, and welcome back to r/ProRevenge. Let's start our video with the story of a homeless beggar who found an original way to get money for beer. But before we begin, don't forget to subscribe to our channel if you're new here and turn on notifications so you don't miss a new video every single day. Here we go. Beer by the tracks. I was on the Berlin Underground waiting on a train with a beer in hand. It's normal here, trust me. When I saw a homeless guy coming my way, I immediately thought he was going to ask for money, but nope. "Can I have a sip of your beer?" he says. I was so taken aback and confused by the question, not to mention grossed out at the thought of some stranger slobbering on my beer bottle, that before I knew it, I'd reached into my pocket and found just about enough for a cheap beer and handed it to him, telling him to buy his own. If he directly asked me for money, he most likely wouldn't have gotten any. So either this guy has a genius new way of panhandling, or my synapses just misfired and made me crumble when I really should have told the dude where to go. And our next story. Land of the Rising Sun and the real Godzilla. People involved. Me, your hero. Mr. Fuji, the villain. Mr. Hiroshi, the big boss. Mr. Kiyoshi, the victim. Miss Rika, Mr. Hiroshi's PA. The story happened back in 2014, which was my first year in Japan. I'd originally moved to China back in 2012, but was headhunted by this Japanese firm 2 years into my Chinese contract. I come from Europe and had gotten a job in the Far East working in marketing. You see, I have a particular set of skills that's quite sought after in Asia, hence the headhunting. Anyway, my first week in the new company, I was scheduled to go on a factory tour with all the other new employees. This is where I meet Mr. Kiyoshi. Mr. Kiyoshi was a young guy fresh out of college and ready to take on the world. Although I was older by 7 years or so, we got on well. For a kid out of college, he was very mature and very respectful, and I must admit I took an instant liking to him. He did have his flaws, such as he was very naive, no backbone, and had issues with confrontation. This is important later. I should point out that although I'm working for a Japanese firm, the company is very much an international company, which means everybody is speaking English. That is, of course, except the middle management. Now, Mr. Fuji enters the story. Mr. Fuji at first seemed like a really nice guy. He was not my boss, as he was corporate department and I was public relations, but he could not speak a lick of English, and I could not speak a lick of Japanese. Somehow, we kind of bonded over this for the first few weeks, as we both do a GD awful job of speaking each other's native tongue, but I progressed quickly in Japanese. I was lucky to land my job and had the opportunity to take Japanese lessons on company time, which basically meant 3 days in the office and 3 days in the classroom. Over the year, I progressed quickly and could start to hold conversations in my third language, my second being Chinese. Now, Mr. Fuji was Mr. Kiyoshi's boss. Over the months, I'd started to notice a big change in Mr. Kiyoshi. He came into work looking like crap. His suit was always dirty. His face always looked tired. He just looked so bummed out all the time. The sad thing is, I really never saw him that much around the head office, as our jobs both take us to different parts of the country all the time. So it was rare to see him, but when I did, he just looked like crap. 3 weeks had passed, and everybody in the company was told the company will have its 80-year anniversary party the following month. Great. Can't wait for a mass company party. Should be a good time. Company party comes up, and everybody had a good time. After the main party, the sales boys from Hong Kong, Vietnam, Thailand, and France ask us if guys from public relations want to join them in an after party. Hell to the yeah. I'm going out drinking with the sales team. I've known from previous experience, going out with the sales team usually ends up in the legends of time. This is where I bumped into Mr. Kiyoshi. He's young, so the sales guys and girls ask him to come along. He's also a good-looking dude, plus a native to Japan, so he was an instant summon to this after-party group. We all had a good time, and yes, it was a very messy night. All I can remember is making out with a girl from Colombia and pulling one of the sales guys off a girl from Taiwan. I think Taiwan. Her Chinese for me was a little weird, so I'm going to assume Taiwan. Anyway, the last man standing ended up being me and Mr. Kiyoshi, and we had a very deep conversation about our company. This is where Mr. Kiyoshi just let loose with all sorts of information. Now, I've been around for a while. I've even worked for a major car manufacturer, so I've gotten to know people like to complain about their boss, but this was with passion and hate. Mr. Kiyoshi told me how Mr. Fuji basically bullied him every day, telling him how useful he is, how he would not even spit on him if he was on fire. He even threatened physical violence against him. I was kind of shocked by what he was telling me, and ill, to be honest. It was difficult to believe, as I've hung out with Mr. Fuji a few times, and not once did he come across as a bully or even a crappy boss. But of course, please remember, my language ability at this time was not on point, so maybe I'm missing context to the situation. Anyway, I go home, sleep off my hangover for the entire weekend, and go to work on Monday. Now, I've been having a bit of the thing with the chairman of the company, PA, Miss Rika, just like the sports bike was smoking hot and hard to handle, but I dig it. I'm always up for a challenge. We had a coffee date later that week where I mentioned about Mr. Fuji and Mr. Kiyoshi's situation and how for me it was difficult to believe. She laughed and said I had no concept of tradition in Japan and that Mr. Fuji is an old-school Japanese businessman, and that's why he's working in corporate, because everybody in that department has an old mind about business. Okay, I had no idea what that really means, and I asked her to fill me in. She tells me in the old days it was common for the newer members of the staff to bend over backwards towards the higher-ups and do anything they say without question. Obey, obey, obey was the quote she used. She then said it was not uncommon for the newer recruits to do their boss's laundry on a weekend or wash his car, that sort of stuff. Gobsmacked by what she's telling me, she then states Mr. Fuji is a little bitter at head management because he was always passed over for director for two reasons. First, he never bothered learning English, which meant he could never lead a team of foreigners, and second, even upper management knew of his old-style ways, and even they thought it was out of touch with globalization. You have to remember that upper management in a Japanese company usually consists of old men above 70 and 80 years old. I tell her about the bullying, and she says she can't do anything about it, but might be able to earwig it to Mr. Hiroshi, the chairman, but she'll need evidence of it going on. I had to think about this, and although I liked Mr. Kiyoshi, I was not sure if sticking my neck out for him would be a bad political move on my part. Not only this, but I'd not seen anything that would question Mr. Fuji's honor, as it were. Few months down the line, and I'm doing well in my job and up for a promotion. As I'm heading to my weekly meeting, I bump into Mr. Fuji and Mr. Kiyoshi on the stairs. Mr. Fuji, red in the face with anger, clenched fists with a very aggressive posture with little respect for Mr. Kiyoshi's personal space. Mr. Kiyoshi was feeble in posture, face and eyes red, with tears pouring down his face. I asked, "Is everything okay?" To which both replied they were fine and there was an accident, but Mr. Kiyoshi is okay now. I smelled bullcrap. I've hung out with enough sales and marketing guys to smell bullcrap a mile off, but coming from corporate department that usually don't spin tails, it was easy to see they were bullcrapping. I didn't push the matter and carried on to my weekly meeting, but took note of what I'd just seen. At lunchtime, I made it my mission to seek out Mr. Kiyoshi and ask what the hell is going on. He told me I had just saved him from Mr. Fuji as he was about to physically harm him. I had enough by this point. I'm going to crush this man. You need to remember the country I'm currently living in. If this was a U.S. office or an EU office, confrontation would have been sorted out face to face. But in Japan, people like to do things in a passive-aggressive manner, but try and avoid confrontation as much as possible. So I knew if I went up to Mr. Fuji and threatened to beat his butt, all this would do is cause me problems. I needed another way to destroy him. A few months go past, and I'm now in charge of marketing and directly report to the chairman of the company. Now, how I got this position, to some extent, can be seen as a little suspicious. You see, the chairman's PA was also his daughter. They don't share the same last name, so you'd never know from the outside, and it was known that I was dating her around the office. You could argue I slept my way to the top, but I disagree with this, as in the beginning I had no idea. Regardless, I was in a position of power, and the corporate department directly responds to me now. This meant Mr. Fuji responded to me. He didn't like this, as you can imagine. He'd been working at the company for over 10 years, and I was promoted to a higher position than him in 3 years. This guy made my life difficult for months on end, refused to do stuff I asked, reports, etc. Nothing dramatic, just usual company crap. Now, I know what you're thinking. It might be a communication problem, as we did not speak the same language. This was my 3rd year in Japan, and by then I had a grasp on the concepts of the language, so I can honestly say it was him being a jackwagon, not a communication problem. The revenge. Anyway, few more months down the line, I'm having a dinner and a few drinks with the board members and mention my disdain for Mr. Fuji, which gained a bit of attention from the board members, to which they of course ask why. Now, I could have gone down the route of just telling him, oh, he's bullying staff members, refuses to do the work I said for him, yada, yada, yada. But I grew up in a house with a father who was CEO of his own company and a mother who was a lawyer for contract law, so I responded that this guy would make it difficult for the company to grow in the foreign markets as his way of doing things is very old-fashioned and would be difficult for him to fit in with the globalization of most companies, and this is probably why we keep losing our contracts to Chinese firms. I also suggested that he might be better working for the accounting team, as this has no effect on our frontline business. You need to remember, this is about as passive-aggressive as I could get. There are no fights, no anger, just pure venom being spewed out of my mouth about how this guy is going to affect the company's bottom line. The board members took notice and listened to not only my complaints about him, but also my view on how to deal with it. Week later, I get a memo saying Mr. Fuji will be leaving the company to pursue his own future. Score! The effer was fired. Hey guys, thank you all for watching the video. I'll see you in the next one.